want to introduce, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, already know Susan Carroll, and she will be doing harp history and innovations, speaking on that and playing the harp this afternoon. But we also want to welcome her friend Mike that's going to be taking some pictures of Susan, just of Susan this afternoon. But let's give them both a warm Westminster Canterbury welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you very much for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be here today and to share something with you that is a passion for me, but also something I'm so excited to share this with you today, because while I had done a previous harp history research project, this time I really dug much deeper, and I found myself falling into several rabbit holes, so to speak, because this is such a deep well, and there are multiple avenues on which we could journey together with this, but not all today. So many good side trails we could take, but I'm really hoping today to pique your interest about the topic of this beautiful, extraordinary instrument. The harp is one of the oldest instruments in the world, and there are other instruments that are very old as well. But it's been part of nearly every culture around the world for centuries. And the interesting part about that is that the harp had to evolve and adapt over time just in order to survive. This instrument, for a variety of reasons, which I will go into later. Another aspect of the harp that I do want to include today, and just a little bit, snippets here and there, because again, this could be its own topic, its own exploration, but the important contribution of the harp as its use as an instrument of healing practice back to ancient cultures. It's a very, very old use of the harp, in addition to its beauty for entertainment, for worship traditions, and a variety of uses. We know that in ancient Egypt, Africa, Mesopotamia, Greco-Roman, Arab, Indian subcontinent, classical Chinese medicine, and Native American practices utilize this instrument, and they recognize that music used for healing is one of the oldest branches in the field of medicine. A lot of people don't necessarily know that because kind of took a detour along the way, and we're making our way back to that recognition and that realization and the utilization of music for our health, mind, body, and spirit. Another topic. But the ancients in multiple cultures composed harmonious chants and hymns as part of the healing practice. They used sound vibrations. They learned that the use of sound and vibrations could be very beneficial for healing practices. So many connections between music and medicine and religion and faith tradition. They were very intertwined, and this is evident in many primitive tribal civilizations, some of which are still in use today, more in Eastern practice, but not as much in Western medicine, but it's making its way back there. They used sound vibrations for the healing practice. And then in Egypt, as a matter of fact, the connection between the music and the religion and the healing was so great that the priests were required to become both musicians and physicians. And so this is very interesting as we consider this. So I have included pictures for you today because it's so fascinating to see how the design of this instrument has changed over time. This instrument we can document back to 2500 BC, Mesopotamia. In these images here, what I'm sharing with you, some of the oldest lyres. We're going to first talk about lyres. Lyres and harps we hear interchanged a lot, and in scriptural use, they tend to be utilized back and forth, but not always, they are not the same instrument. But some of the oldest lyres in the world were discovered in Ur. Now, Ur is an ancient area, but is currently South Iraq for our purposes today. And these lyres actually date back after the flood, Noah and the flood story in Scripture, and before Abram or Abraham. So still very early Old Testament Genesis time. They were discovered by archaeologists at the Royal Cemetery at Ur, and they were given to the Iraq Museum. Now, what you're looking at, the picture on the left, is Leonard Woolley holding the remains of this, what they consider to be the Sumerian Queen's lyre, and he discovered this in 1922. They did do a restoration. In the picture on the right, the lower one, what I want to call your attention to is that this is one of the famous lyres of Ur, and there was a restoration of the Sumerian Queen's lyre. The one on the right-hand side looks a little bit more rugged. This one here, they did have to refurbish the wood, and the animal symbol on the front was also replicated. But in here, when you look, if you could see this closer, there is beautiful, elaborate inlay. And it's amazing because they utilized decorations, and these are the original decorations. They used mother of pearl, they used shells, lapis, carnelian, and bitumen. Bitumen is a mineral that gives beautiful color, and those inlays survived and were able to be recovered, which is so very interesting. Now here is a lyre found also at the Royal Cemetery at Ur. This one was given to the Iraq Museum. And again, you can see a little bit closer that detail. Beautiful and ornate. And we're talking once again back in the 2500 to 2400 BC time frame. Now this is a replica. This is a reproduction of the golden lyre of Ur, which we know is the present Iraq. And again, seeing that beautiful, the ornate nature, that is probably more of what it would have looked like in its actual time. But so again, now one thing that we notice here is the straight bar across the top, and the strings are suspended from that bar, and the lower body of the harp is fairly shallow. It's a box shape, but fairly shallow. So we're going to see how that kind of transforms. And in this, this depiction, this is a panel of the standard of Ur. On the left, you can see that the lyreist, the person playing the lyre, we see this excavated from the same site as the lyres of Ur. And what's interesting is to see actually a depiction of how the instrument was played. And it looks fairly large, but the person is holding it and playing it, holding it with one hand and playing it with the other hand. And these kinds of artifacts have been so valuable to help us to see how these instruments were utilized by the peoples of that time. And again, the colorization is really beautiful. It's so lovely, and it's wonderful that they were able to discover that. Some of the other reliefs that I will share with you in their original time had colorization, but that deteriorated over time, and what we see left is the imprint. Now, in this, I've shared with you a few photos here. On the upper left-hand side, we see a replica of an older lyre. The lowest picture would be a modern lyre, because the lyre is definitely still played today. It's something that would be considered a handheld instrument. Sometimes you can strum it with just one hand. Some people strum it with both hands on either side of the instrument. The picture on the upper right would be considered an Egyptian lyre. Now, this is a beautiful, once again, we see a relief of carving showing a bit larger lyre and how the people played it. And again, seeing some of these really ancient artifacts shows us so much about when they find the actual pieces, how the people utilize them. And it's wonderful, very valuable to have these kinds of images and these beautiful reliefs. Now, meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, they developed first what is considered the bow harp. So when you look at this picture on the left, What does that make you think of? Bow and arrow, exactly. And so you can see how that evolved. You know, the bow and arrow. It's considered developed from literally from the huntsman's bow, and so they must have discovered that they could add a few strings and get some sound and actually produce a musical instrument. These, of course, being a bit much more rugged than the golden lyre of Ur, but again, those lyres that I showed you previously, they would have been part of royalty. And these would have been much more in commonplace use. The picture on the right, much more angular, but another kind of harp that they've discovered images of. Now, one of the things that's important to notice is that with the bow harp, this is not going to be able to support a much tension because it's missing something on the front that's different than this harp. What is it missing? Yes, the front column or the four-pillar. Exactly. And so that was gave it some limitation, but certainly a good, very good beginning for them. This is another depiction of an ancient Egyptian arched or bow harp discovered from the New Kingdom. They date this to 1500 to 1100s BC. These early lyres were discovered in Israel, Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, and Greece, and really beautiful. And also, they discovered that these particular bow harps were similar to those found in Uganda and other African areas. Now next, we're going to look at, this is an ancient Egyptian arched harp. Again, we're seeing more detail, beautiful ornate detail. And of course, this is a bit rugged, but it's amazing that it survived even this much intact of the detail of the carvings. Very beautiful. And some of the colorization remains, which is helpful. And if you look up on the upper left-hand side, you can even see where they perhaps had those tuning pegs. And that helped them to make some differentiation of the tuning of the different strings. And here is a much larger arched harp. These come from hieroglyphics that were discovered in ancient burial tombs. Again, Egyptian culture, and very beautiful and interesting to see how they played the instruments. This would be dated about 1200 BC. Now the next one I'm going to show you is really a greater predecessor to the floor harps that we see. Egypt from the New Kingdom around 1550 to 1070s BC again. On the left you would see what was a depiction from a hieroglyphic. On the right, that is clearly a reproduction. Now it looks, you know, much larger and more substantial. However, the base of the harp is probably not hollowed out. It is probably just more of a solid piece. Still missing the front pillar, the front column, but very close to our harps of today of that shape. Now, this is what is believed to be closest resembling of David's harp. This ancient lyre is called a kinnor, a little similar to those harps that were found from the Mesopotamia, the Sumerian lyres, and this dates back to about 1000 to 950 BC. Again, a little more rugged looking than some of those others that are more ornate. Something that we know about this lyre was discovered, it's a little bit smaller. It was discovered also in Israel, Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, and Greece. What we know is that this gives us one of the earliest stories of the harp being utilized in healing. Of course, many of us know the story of David playing for King Saul and how the music soothed King Saul's anxiety and pain and distress. And that is recorded for us. And it's interesting to read that story that comes from 1 Samuel. Now, what we know, unfortunately, we don't have the songs that came from the Psalms in the Bible. We don't have musical notation for them. But what we do know, archaeologists and musicologists were able to discover the tuning that was used for these lyres. They would have had 10 to 12 strings, and the tuning would sound like this. So you can hear that Eastern, that Middle Eastern sound. And so a little bit different than what we typically hear. And I'll share a little bit more about that with you in a moment. Now, this is very interesting. Here we see this is a Hittite musical relief from Turkey, dated to about 800 to 701 BC time frame. This was around the time of the early kings of Israel and Judah. And here in this relief, we see two types of the lyre. On the left, you see the one that has the straight top, more like the one that was David's lyre that we just saw, the top piece of wood and the strings hanging down with the sound box below. This is the third figure right here. But when you look at the one on the right, we see an angular line to that top piece. And that would have given them, on the left, they had 6 or so equal length strings. It was a little taller, a little larger sound chamber to produce a little bit more sound. Now, the one on the right, however, had, they believe, 8 tapered strings. They varied in length, and by varying the length of the strings, that's going to give a wider range of tones. And it's being played just above the sound chamber, which is the box that would be right here would be the sound chamber, and the sound chamber on that one. Now, this next relief was really exciting to me, very interesting. This is a Lachish relief, dated approximately 700 to 692 BC. And that area, called Lachish, is now part of modern-day Israel. Lachish was a community that was southwest of Jerusalem, and it was second in size to Jerusalem, so it was a substantial community. This relief is currently housed in the British Museum. It's part of a much larger collection. It depicts the Assyrian capture of the Lachish people, and it was discovered from the palace of Sennacherib in Nineveh, which is modern-day Iraq. Now, these reliefs were likely created by the subjects of Sennacherib. He was the ruler of the Assyrian Empire and considered the terror of the Middle East around 700 BC. And if you were to look this up, you would see many more reliefs, pieces of a much larger relief, and they told the story of all of this, how it unfolded. It was quite fascinating to read this and to learn more about it. What we see in this is we see the Judean prisoners are playing the lyres. The soldier, the Assyrian soldier, is the left character, and the subsequent 3 characters are playing the lyres, and this is considered part of the Assyrian capture. And what the writer of an article that I read about this commented on is that the 3 musicians, they were likely Judean prisoners. They're marching under the escort of through a very mountainous country, but it was reminiscent of the biblical lament in Psalm 137. And this is a favorite psalm of myself and other musicians. Now, this was not the time of that psalm, because that psalm was written related to the Babylonian capture of the Hebrew people, but which happened maybe about 100 or so years later than this. But once again, we can see something that kind of helps us to be reminded of the scripture in Psalm 137 that says, "There we hung our harps on the willow trees. There our captors asked for us a song. But how can we sing the songs of Zion while in a foreign land?" That is so meaningful to me. And I want to share with you something that this, of course, as you know, we don't have anything to tell us the melodies of the Psalms. We know the Psalms were songs and continued to be songs throughout the early church and even today. We don't have those melodies, but there's a wonderful, very talented harpist who's done a tremendous amount of work in researching the sacred use of the harp in history. And he traveled to Jerusalem and spent some time there, and while there, in the night, he had dreams. And in his dreams, this is such a wonderful dream, melodies came to him, and he believed that they were really inspired by being in that place. He was so inspired by the culture, and he believes that these were inspired melodies for him. This is one that he's created, and he showed, when he first played it, he showed it played on one of those, a replica of the kinnor, which is believed to be like David's harp, the harp of David. And it might have sounded something like this. Of course, this is not the melody, the actual melody, but we can kind of imagine, we use our imagination and consider this might have been something like that. Now, at that time, it would have been a melody instrument, but adding a little bit with our harp of today, we can fill that in just a little bit. So perhaps something reminiscent of that Psalm 137. Well, to pick up on the healing aspect of the harp, this is a image depicting King Arthur, and in about 500 BC, Pythagoras of Samos, Greece, he lived 570 to 495 BC. He was a Greek philosopher credited with many scientific, mathematical, and musical discoveries. He's the one who began the first use of the term musical medicine. He's credited for formulating our tonal intervals in music and size ratios, long and short, high and low, circle of fifths, but he believed that everything in the universe, from the minute cells to the planets themselves, vibrate. And he created the theory that we hear, the music of the spheres. He believed that each string of the lyre echoed one of the heavenly stars and created harmony of the spirit and health for the body. And he actually recommended lyre music for his patients. Again, in around 400 BC, Plato, another Greek philosopher, he was influenced by Pythagoras. He also believed very strongly and described music as the medicine of the soul. And so we see that thread continuing through of the use of the harp in healing practice. Now, what is going on in another part of the world is that they discovered the Pict people, P-I-C-T people, were peoples who lived in the highlands and the lowlands of Scotland. And these people developed a harp. Now we see the harp is actually looking more like the triangular shape. And they are depicted on many of these stones that have been discovered. The Pict people actually did not leave any written language, but they carved many stones and crosses with images, and many of these images include harps. And now we see it looks like the harp that we recognize, that triangular shape. And many sources have proven the Celtic people had a very strong spiritual connection with the harp. And some of the harp images from the Pict people are considered representation of David playing the harp in the Old Testament. I want to play just a little portion of, here is another depiction. This is the harp on the Dublin cross in Scotland, dated back to 800 AD. And I'll play a little something. This is a chant song that would be dated around 500 to 800 AD. So this will give you an idea of perhaps what they were hearing in the harp in that time. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what some of that kind of music would have sounded like. Now let's see here that we now have the Irish frame harp. It includes a column, and art from this time tells us that they utilized about 10 or 12 strings. So this harp is going to be able to withstand a little bit more tension. Another really important part of the use of music and the harp in the healing practice, around 1000 AD, the Cluny Monastery in France, a French abbey, Benedictine monks played harps for healing and to assist people through the transition of life into passing. Now, as an aside, the earliest hospitals were infirmaries typically housed in monasteries. And so there is a very interesting thread of continuity, as I mentioned, that connection between the music and the healing and spiritual practice. Now, in Ireland and Scotland, we get to about 1000 to 1600 AD time. These are two of the three only remaining harps of that time. And there's a sad reason for that, which I'll explain in a moment. But the harp on the left is currently housed in, has anybody here traveled to Ireland or Scotland? You may have seen, have any of you seen in the Trinity College, the museum, or in Edinburgh, Scotland, you might have seen these. They are well protected there. They are kept under close supervision because they are treasures of Ireland and Scotland. And now what we see is a much stronger, sturdier instrument. This certainly is going to be an instrument that has much more substantial wood. We see in the four-pillar, thicker wood, the neck of the harp, which is actually this part at the top, and the sound box. For the first time we see a sound box that's actually hollow, and you can see a few holes there. And that is, of course, going to be helpful to get more sound out of the instrument. Now, something that these harps were known as Celtic harp, the Gaelic harp, also the clarsach in Gaelic language. They're fashioned after the Brian Boru harp, and that is the one in the left side that is in the Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. The wire-strung clarsach now, of course, can handle more strings. About 30 to 36 brass strings. They produce a very bright sound, typically played with fingernails. People often ask me, do you have fingernails? No, I do not. I need to keep my fingernails very, very low, very, very short, because I'm playing more mellow. But there are people today that intentionally grow fingernails on their right hand to utilize as picks. Particularly in the Scottish and Irish, more spirited, lively music, it gives that brighter sound. But this was the first harp to feature that hollowed sound box to amplify the sound. And that curved column is going to create a little more strength there. The Brian Boru harp is these harps were so important in the culture of both of these countries. The official emblem of Ireland, this is one of the coat of arms, one of multiple ones, and the harp you can see, and if you've been to Ireland and Scotland, you see the harp on everything. It is a national symbol. It's considered a national treasure, and that was the case from back to 1000 AD. You see it on the coins. The harp is featured all over Ireland, and the harps that you see in these depictions were copied from the Brian Boru harp. The Irish and Scottish kings and chieftains had their own resident harper. The harper held very high status in the court, in royalty. These harps were central to Welsh and Irish and Scottish music traditions up until the 1600s. Now, unfortunately, the harp was so revered, it was so beloved, and such an important embedded part of the people's tradition and their culture that it became a symbol of resistance to the Crown of England. Therefore, the Irish and the Scottish harps were banned in the mid-1600s, and that's why so very few harps, the actual harps, are remaining from that period. So what I want to do, I of course don't have one of those beautiful wire-strung harps, but there are some people who do have reproductions of them. What I do have that I brought for you today, this is my lovely little Reverie harp. This is a much newer harp. This has probably been around for about 10 years or so, or less than 10 years. But I brought it to demonstrate for you the difference in the sound of the strings. Because this little harp, it's very small little hollow body, lightweight, mahogany wood, which is a wonderful wood, very strong, so it can withstand the pressure. But the wire strings give us a really nice different sound. So I wanted to give you just a little hint. This is not going to be quite as projecting or quite as bright as those beautiful harps from the Trinity College or Mary Queen of Scots harp. But give a listen to the sound of the wire strings. And so it's kind of amazing that even though it's a really small instrument, it has that projection and lovely resonance.
Is that one designed just to play with one hand?
Pretty much, yes. Mostly, for the most part, you hold it, and this actually is considered a therapy harp. Some people like to hold it like this, and when you hold it next to you, we're getting off a little bit into another topic, but the wonderful thing about this is that the person who's holding it and playing it actually is getting the benefit of what we call forced resonance of the instrument, as opposed to sympathetic resonance. What we get in the room when I'm playing this harp, we all get this sympathetic resonance. The sound vibrations are traveling through the air, and we all get benefit from that. But when you contact with the instrument directly, you can feel the vibrations. And if you were to come up and sit perhaps on the front column of my harp, you would feel those vibrations. So you would hold it with one arm and play it with the other. This harp is very specially tuned such that you don't have to have any experience in playing it. In pre-COVID time, I've handed it to folks and let them play it, and they can just enjoy strumming. And you can pick in any combination. All the tones work beautifully, and there's a musical reason for that. It's called the pentatonic tuning. And all of those tones work harmoniously together in any combination. And it's wonderful. And if you have wind chimes, your wind chimes might be pentatonically tuned. And in that way, no matter which chimes hit each other or strike each other, they're all going to sound beautiful together in any combination. So that is the purpose of this harp. Thank you for asking. Yes, indeed. But I wanted to just give you the opportunity to hear what that might sound like, because the wire strings give it a different character. So then we had in the Europe tradition, what's going on simultaneously is the development of the harp into what was called the Bray harp. Now there are some people who play the Bray harp today. They are considered early instruments, much smaller, more like a lap harp. And they were called Bray harp. They were very popular across Europe in the Renaissance and early Baroque time. The reason why it's called the Bray harp is because they had little buzzers at the bottom of the strings, and they considered it to bray like a donkey. Now, the sound of these harps is very different than the mellow sound of the harp that I play. If you heard it, you would hear the distinction of it, brighter and that braying kind of sound. Now, also what happened, the next development of the harp is now we see more like a floor harp. We've got this full-size harp, it's got multiple strings, and this is considered a diatonic harp. And that means it has a single row of strings, and it can play tones in what is called the diatonic scale. This was popular in the Renaissance between the 1400s, 1600s AD. And the music was changing dramatically. These harps differed from the Irish harps. They're thinner. They have less curved pillar. You see that straight front column. A slender neck, which the neck is this part of the harp right here, with a bit more of a curved pillar. That might have been decorative. And 24 or more gut strings. And so what is happening in Europe is that the music is changing dramatically. It's becoming more sophisticated. Composers are expecting more from this instrument, and they need more flexibility from the instruments to continue growing with the musical times. And the music, when we got into this period, became beyond the capabilities of the diatonic harp. If the harp was to survive, it had to develop and do so quickly. But why? Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate on my harp for a moment what is called a diatonic scale. And in the middle of my harp, for anyone who knows piano, the middle of my harp, the red strings are all C's. And all of the blue strings are F. And the color system is pretty universal with harps of many different kinds. But they function similarly to the white and black keys on the piano. Now, I have my harp tuned in such a way that I can give us a C to C diatonic scale, much like if you were to begin at middle C on the piano and go up an octave. The do, re, mi. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Now, the difference is, give me just a moment, I'm going to flip around here to the piano because we hear these principal 8 tones. But on the piano, you're able to do this. And I'm going to play a chromatic scale quickly. Oh, I'm sorry, we thought that would not do that. I apologize. Now let's see if I can. So you heard some semitones, and that is what constitutes a chromatic scale. On the harp that I am playing, I can do that, but it's really not efficient. If I do that, I'll be raising my levers. That's a double tone. So you see that's not very efficient. So what are they going to do? They've got one row of strings. They don't even have levers like I have at this point. So the first thing that they did was, let's add a row of strings. So now we have this beautiful Italian Baroque Esta harp in 1580. This is a double row harp, double rows. What does that mean? 2 rows of strings right next to each other. It's very narrow. This is going to be a little tricky because the harpist has got to play 2 different rows of strings. And what I know about double rowed harps is there's a brain thing that has to happen. You've got to be able to adjust. Complicated, tricky little instruments to play. Interesting idea. And so they came up with that. Then, in the 1600s, we have what was called arpedoppia, and that is harps that were developed with 2 strings or 3 rows of strings. The Italian triple harp became popular in the 1700s, and these are replications right here, but the harp on the left has 59 strings. I have 36. 59 strings. The harp on the right has 78 strings. Now, the trick with the triple harp is, okay, we have 2 strings. When you add a 3rd row string in the middle, you have to go between the outer 2 rows. But what's happening is you've got your diatonic strings on the outside, but on the inside you've got these little semitones in the inside. So we're able to get all the tones now. All right, and then the Spanish people in Spain, they came up with something a little bit unorthodox. They decided to cross the strings. Well, as you can imagine, this produced something very different. Needless to say, the double chromatic harp, the arpa chromatica in the 1800s, did not last a real long time. The problems with these is, I mean, very interesting, of course. The affected sound achieved from the instrument is very exciting. And the Spanish loved this sound because it was much like the bright, brilliant guitar music, and it matched the spirited dance music that was so popular in the Spanish culture in this time. What is unique, of course, in this harp on the left, you see, we've got two necks now, two necks. We've got two bodies of the harp, two columns that need to cross in the middle. It's large, it's expensive to build, expensive to maintain, complex to play, virtually abandoned by the mid-1900s. And so the Spanish double harp was very popular, but and actually Monteverdi created operas because they required a fully chromatic harp. It has a bright percussive sound. The music incorporated polyrhythms of the African music, and so ultimately this harp, while it did not continue in this way, it made its way when the Spanish went to South America, they created something new called the Paraguayan harp. And so the double-strung harps are not popular in that culture now, but what is very popular is this beautiful Paraguayan harp. It's played a bit differently than the way we play, the way I play my harp. The right hand is played right close to the top of the neck, gives a little bit of a more percussive sound, brilliant. The music tends to be very spirited. It's so popular in that culture, but that was something that was a further development and still in use today. And this is Nicholas Carter. He's a very popular South American Paraguayan harpist. Something else to note is that all of the tuning pins are on the top of the neck, right up here on the top. I've seen several of these in person. It's very beautiful. Doesn't usually stand up on its own. It usually lays down, but very interesting. Well, now, the Austrians did something a little bit different. In the 16 to 1700s, trying to figure out what to do about this problem of not getting enough tones. So Austria developed what was called the hook harp, and this was the predecessor to the levers that I have today, except that they were hooks. The problem with the hooks is they're complicated. It's hard for the harpist to change these things, when they need to get the accidentals and change it. It was appealing because of the single row versus the complexity of these multi-row harps, but cumbersome to change those. The developers were actually more interested in improving on that hook mechanism rather than the hooks themselves, and that led to the earliest forms of the pedal harps. But something else, that triple harp. The triple harp became so popular in English tradition, in England and Wales, it really caught on. And so again, this is the harp with 3 rows, and the Welsh triple harp is continued, very popular in Welsh tradition today. Now this is Mary Triola, my wonderful friend in Fredericksburg. She was my first harp teacher. She is one of a handful of people who play the Welsh triple harp in this country today. And she said, now she was classically trained as a harpist in college, and this harp took her 2 to 3 years to learn to play, although she was very accomplished on the single course, the single row harp. But it's a beautiful thing. It's wonderful to watch people play it. And it continues in use today, and their tradition for the Welsh is to teach it by rote. They don't use written music. The teacher sits there with their harp, the student sits there with their harp, the teacher plays a pattern, the student replicates it. And the music is literally done by rote, not through written music to this day. It's very interesting, very interesting. It was very efficient earlier on before music was notated. But again, that's another sidetrack. We won't go there. But as you can imagine, it is very tricky going in between these strings. But by the 1800s, the triple harp was no longer popular in the rest of Europe. Again, too difficult to play. Composers are still struggling. What are we going to do with the limitations of this instrument? It just can't quickly enough change the keys. Well, what does that exactly mean? I'll show you very quickly. Here is what happens. So you are familiar with the beautiful Fur Elise by Beethoven. Okay, so on my harp, if I don't do anything, listen to this for a moment. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Okay, so the problem is that what we have to do is we have to do this. So you see what I mean? Yeah. It's possible, but again, it's just really not efficient. And so,
Does the right hand and the left hand play the same strings, or are they different?
usually different.
They all
Yes, different.
left hand and
Yeah, so for just to give you a practicality of it, what's happening is the right hand is playing what is considered the treble staff. For pianists, you know, middle C is the middle of the piano, and the music that I read looks like piano or keyboard music. The right hand would typically play this side of the instrument, the left hand playing the bass. Occasionally there's crossover when you do things like, you might do a little bit of crossover. But good question. Thank you for asking that. So we then come to the evolution of the single action pedal harp. The French loved the harp. The composers really wanted to use it, include it in the music, and so they took that hook mechanism, improved on it, added more discs and more levers actually inside. And so we had this. It was originally, the single action pedal harp had 5 pedals. And the double action pedal harp was then created in 1800. And the double action pedal harp responds to stronger technique by the player. So we have more strings, we have much more gears, complicated gears and mechanism going on up in the neck of this harp. And so the body of the harp needed to become much more substantial. And obviously we see that in the body of these beautiful harps. Pretty much this is the way that the pedal harp has continued unto today. And it produces a larger sound for larger performance halls and venues. And the French loved the harp a lot. Claude Debussy was someone who recorded music for the harp and just gave us some beautiful music, other wonderful composers of that time. And it did help the harp to be able to be part of the orchestra, which was very, very important. Now, I'm going to share with you for just a moment a little something. This will give us a sense of some of Claude Debussy's music. This is a light version, but also to give us a sense of that kind of healing idea, the therapeutic idea of the harp. And so this is something you'll hear just a little bit of the motif from Claude Debussy's beautiful Clair de Lune. Let's kind of see how this makes you feel or helps you feel. Well, then, meanwhile, in Ireland, the harp began to have invigorated interest. The harp began to be reinvented after the ban of the harps, they were eventually allowed back into the culture. And so a gentleman named Mr. Egan took one of those smaller harps and invented the blade harp. The blade harp was the next step from the hook harp. And instead of these levers that I have are wonderful in a tactile sense because of this nice flat edge. They have a good throw distance, they're easy to move, but at that time there were actual little metal blades that the harpist had to move up and down. So not quite so efficient, but it did help them to begin to reclaim their harping tradition. The harp on the left is the Egan portable blade harp. Then in early 1900s, Mr. Clark developed what is closest resembling to the Irish harps of today, the Clark harp. There are a few of those still around. They're very, very popular. They are very much in demand, very valuable if you can find one. And they are so lovely. They're really lovely. And again, now one thing that I want to mention to you is that people often see my harp and they say, oh, it's a baby harp. Actually, it is a real harp. The beautiful large concert pedal harps are authentic to the French and Italian, the European tradition of harps. This is authentic to the Irish and Scottish tradition of Celtic harps, and actually a little bit on the large side, because you see that Clark harp, a lot of the current Irish and Scottish harps are 32 to 34 strings. This is a bit on the larger side, but it's every bit as much of a true harp as the pedal harps. Just a little bit different sound, perhaps some different purposes to the instrument. And so I wanted to share with you, I think the idea of innovation is that the harp has been going through innovation all the time. But something that's been really great is the ability to put amplification to my harp. My harp doesn't project exactly the same as the pedal harps, but by running a pickup through the soundboard of my harp, the harp builder that built this harp, he came up with one of the most popular, what's called a pickup system. It's amplification that's directly on the soundboard. I have a little notch on the bottom where I can plug in a cord. I can plug into any amplification system, and my portable amplifier, you've seen me sometimes bring it and use it. It does help to make the harp sound. It's still true to the acoustic, but it just amps up the sound, gives it a little bit more volume so that it can be used outside and it can be used in larger spaces and venues. So another innovation is the material that the harp is made of. So this is a little something different, right? This is an electroacoustic harp, 36 strings, the same number of strings as my harp. But these are harps that are wearable. They are fully made of fluorocarbon. They are carbon fiber harps, which means they're much more lightweight. This particular harp, you can wear it with a guitar strap, weighs about 16 pounds. And then another innovation within the last 15 years or so is this beautiful carbon fiber harp, because they said, okay, well, can you make a floor size harp? One that looks a little more traditional, because that is not traditional. And another thing I'll tell you about this harp is, if you play this harp acoustically without being plugged into an amplifier, it sounds like an electric guitar that's not plugged into the amp. It's very flat sounding. So it really is required to have the amplifier to get the full effect. But it's so interesting. It's really, really interesting. But so a gentleman did come up with the ability to make this. This harp is about the same size as mine. It weighs 10.5 pounds. 10.5 pounds. My harp weighs about 28 or 29 pounds. And it's 100% fluorocarbon, which is plastic, a very hard plastic made for boats are made out of carbon fiber. And so it's really useful for certain applications. I've played them before. I've seriously considered them. It still doesn't have the sound of the wood. Doesn't have the sound of the wood. And I tell you, play it and you feel like it's just going to fall over. So that's how lightweight it is. But a lot of people that do what I do with the harp do use these harps. So another really important innovation is the harp in the hospital. The harps come back to the hospital. It started out in the hospital many years ago when the hospital was actually infirmaries in the monasteries. And the harps and the music were there, and they were partners in the practice of helping people with various issues, health issues. And so this is actually my harp in front of the neuro ICU at our local hospital, Lynchburg General. I do take the harp to the hospitals. I can play in the ICUs. When I have my setup here, I'm small enough that I can go into small spaces. I'm not getting in the way of the medical professionals. I'm able to whisk out and get out of the way quickly if necessary, but I'm able to bring the gentle sounds of the harp for people who are dealing with a variety of issues. And a whole nother realm of this that we don't have time to talk about today is how the harp can be really beneficial to us at times when we're not feeling so well or just kind of needing to work through a health issue. Thank you so much. It is just wonderful to share this with you today, and there's more wonderful information perhaps for another day, but I did want to give an opportunity for you to ask your own questions if you had any, and Denise is kind enough, she's going to bring a microphone to help us with that.
Susan, what was the composition? In other words, what were the early strings made of?
Thank you. Good question. Most likely, okay, gut strings. And what that means is organic, animal gut. The very earliest harps, the strings, that's likely what they were made of. And to this day, the concert pedal harps, the large pedal grand harps, are also made out of gut. Often cow gut, actually, is what they usually are. And interestingly, a few years ago, do you remember the mad cow disease?
Oh, yeah.
The mad cow disease, if you think about the trickle-down effect, actually affected the production of harp strings for a while. And for a very short time, I had a gut-strung harp. It's really beautiful, different. I didn't love it as much, but I had it for a short time. It's a beautiful harp, but the strings were popping repeatedly. It was so annoying. I had never had that problem. But the organic nature of the material, they decided that it was actually a whole lot of these gut strings that had been malfunctioning. They were just not up to par. So good question. Thanks for asking that. They're better now.
When did you first become interested, and how long did it take you to feel like I'm making some progress?
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. A lot of people ask me that. I have been playing the harp for 13 years. I will be a perpetual student of this instrument, I believe. But what I would say is probably it took me, I'd say 2 years. I mean, my journey was a starting and stopping and coming back again to the harp, because when you start an instrument as an adult, and maybe perhaps some of you know this, many things we start as adults, we have very high expectations for ourselves. I was not patient. I wanted to be proficient like that because I was a musician, I was a singer, and I thought, well, I played the piano as a child, I had piano foundation, I knew how to read, I got the idea of it, I should be able to, pick this up and quickly be proficient. Because when I first heard this instrument, I loved it so much. My first thought was, I gotta take this and share it with people, because I've lived my whole life and I never heard this before. I'd heard pedal harps in the orchestra, but from a distance. Not in person, not anything that was in the room that I was in. I said, I need to take this to people, but it wasn't ready for prime time for a while. So I would say it took me about a year or two before it was something that people would want to listen to. Thank you for asking.
Is that top design on all the harps for tension on the strings or for looks?
Now, the top design meaning just this neck right here?
All of them seem to have that same curve to them.
Ah, such a good question. This is actually called the harmonic curve. Some of the earlier harps were straight. We've seen pictures of them, various different forms. But a lot of them now do have this harmonic curve. There is something engineering-wise, I don't know the engineering technical purpose of that, but I can tell you there's a lot of strength, a lot of work that goes into making this strong enough to withstand the tension. Because this soundboard is actually relatively thin. I would say it's probably at most a ½ inch thick. Now, consider that there are 1,100 to 1,200 pounds of pressure on this soundboard. And I'm constantly tuning, just incrementally ever so much whenever I'm ready to play the instrument. So there's continuing pulling on this soundboard. So it takes a lot of strength in this neck of the harp, as well as the soundboard. And something else I'll mention to you, this is cherry wood. I someone had asked me about this, and I would love to tell you more about it, and perhaps in another presentation I can go into the woods, because harps are like people. They all have different characters based on the wood. This is cherry wood. Most of the pedal harps, the concert pedal harps, are made of hard maple. They have different finishes, and that's what gives them the different beautiful appearance. Many of them have gold gilding and such, but they are primarily made of hard maple because maple is very, very strong. Cherry is a wonderful wood for harps. It's got a beautiful sound. It's got this wonderful brilliance, lovely sparkly tones in the upper range, but it also gives us beautiful rich resonance in the bass. And so I personally love the sound of cherry. That's the sound that my ear really loves. But there are other woods that these harps, the Celtic harps, are made of. Yes, someone else had a question? Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, the woods are actually like people. Just for a moment, I did include one extra slide because someone had asked me about the woods, and I do get a lot of questions about it. So just very quickly, I'll show you. This gives us kind of an idea. So maple, my harp builder actually came up with this. I love this. So if you are interested in wine, you might be able to relate the differences in the woods. What does that actually mean? So babinga, I had a babinga harp, a black harp. If you ever saw me with the black harp, it had this beautiful bold sound, and I loved the babinga harp. But as I started to play cherry, I realized it just had a little, not quite as woolfy of a sound. The babinga harp had a little bit more of a woolfy sound, but the cherry could project as well, but had just a little bit more sweetness. So they created this pyramid, this lovely visual. And so we've got deep and bold here on this end, our Cabernet Sauvignon. That would be perhaps the deeper, bolder richness. But then walnut is much more mellow, and it's a softer wood. It's more mellow, warmer is considered the color of the sound, like Merlot. At the top of the pyramid, the maple, the hard maple, it's bright, it's crisp. It's another reason why it's good for the pedal harps, because they do need to project quite a bit. And so your Chardonnay would kind of relate to the maple. But they decided the cherry was kind of the best. It was a nice combination. They didn't quite know where to put it, but they felt like it was a little more on the babinga side just because it does project pretty well. And so I love that visual to help understand the difference in the woods. But when you hear the different woods, it's fairly subtle. It's not terribly obvious, but when I sit behind it, I tell you I played them in different woods, and the cherry I just think really is the best for all the purposes that I use for the harp. And so, but that is something that harps are like the people. They have their own personalities. Everyone is different. And even two cherry harps side by side might not sound exactly alike. They have their own character, which is very interesting.
Well, because my husband plays the bass fiddle, I know how the strings are attached. How do you attach those?
Oh, good question. So I'll flip the harp around for a moment and let you see the back of it. The back of the harp, so this whole part of the body is the sound chamber. So obviously, if I had a smaller harp, it is going to produce a smaller sound. The whole length of this sound box is hollow, and the strings come through the back. I have these 3 holes. The holes function partly for sound, but most of the sound is really coming off the front of the soundboard. But there's a little bit of conduction of sound through the sound box from the back, not as much. But literally the strings start in the back here. There's a special harper's knot that you have to learn how to tie that I'm so bad at. I really don't know how to tie the harper's knot. I always have to have help tying my knots. And I don't restring my whole harp myself. I have it strung. They've told me, the wonderful people that I deal with, the technician has said, you need to be on an annual maintenance because I play the harp every day a lot. And so to keep them fresh and sounding their best and tuning the best, it's good for me to have them changed once a year. But I let the technician do that to maintain the proper pressure on the whole instrument as a whole. And so, but yeah, so she's so wonderful at tying knots. She does beautiful knots. But they come up through, and you just really thread them. You start at the back, and you thread them through the little eyelet, and comes up here. It goes through the bridge pin, and then across the tuning pin, and you turn it and wind them off. Yes, good question. Thank you for asking that. Wonderful questions today. Thank you so much.
Play us one of your favorite tunes.
I will, if you have time. I will. I don't want to weary you, but I would be delighted to. Yes.
Hey, Susan. It's a piece of artwork, a harp. I mean, it's beautiful and how it's made. I have to assume they're fairly expensive. Can you give us kind of a price range of what it would cost to purchase a harp?
Woo, yeah, again, broad range, wide range. This particular harp, I will say, this is a one-of-a-kind harp here. This is the 40th anniversary edition of my harp builder. My harp builder is Dusty Strings. He has his beautiful insignia. This little plate, when you see this actually serves a function. It really helps to strengthen the attachment of the neck to the four-pillar or the column of the harp. So when you see that, it's beautiful, but it also serves a function. The harps, you can get, the Celtic harps range in really small harps, 19 strings, 22 strings, 26 strings, the ones that you can wear. Some of them, the really base range would be $600, $700, $800, but then they start to graduate the larger you get. Now this particular harp is considered the top of the line from my builder. This is a professional series, the professional hardwood FH36S, meaning staved back. Some of the harps have a flat box back. The stave is more comfortable and actually gives us just a little bit more sound by having that little bit more of a dimension rather than just being flat. And they can go to $5,000, $6,000, $10,000. When you get into a baseline pedal harp is going to be $10,000 to $12,000 right at the bottom. Again, all the complicated mechanism and such in the harp really requires that. But when you get into gold gilding, we're talking $40,000, $50,000. I usually tell people, yeah, those harps can be the price of a car very easily. They're quite an investment. But thank you, Diane, for mentioning that, because there is so much wonderful workmanship. And one thing that I've learned in my journeys with the harp and experiences with people, I knew how beautiful it was to me, but I wasn't aware that so many other people would be taken with the visual. The aesthetic of the harp is almost as important as the sound of it. And I noticed that people, so it's really wonderful because the experience, you get a multi-sensory experience just by being able to look at it. And to me, I'm a bit of a harp snob because I said, I want my people to have the best. And I really mean that. Honestly, when I discovered this harp and learned that it was available, honestly, I thought of all of you. And I thought, you know what, I really think that my wonderful friends at Westminster Canterbury will appreciate this harp, and they will appreciate the sound of it. And all of my people, my patients, residents, it's very important to me that you get the best experience from this harp. For me, I want to help it to sing its best song because it's a beautiful instrument. It has so much to offer us, and it deserves to be heard in its best possible voice. So yes, it is a work of art, and it is something that that element to it is important as well. And this cherry wood is a premium. It's very highly figured. We believe that part of the extra sound and the amplification of it is from having this beautiful cherry veneer over the soundboard because it just has such an extraordinary sound contrary to the previous one that I had, not that the other one was bad. Any other questions? Yes, Todd.
You mentioned the pedals. Mm-hmm. I kind of understand how pedals work on a piano, but what do they actuate on a harp, and how does that change what you're able to do with a pedal harp?
So interesting. So of course I have the levers, which the pedals are much more efficient. You can change the keys. You will see me sometimes when I'm playing a song, I'll change a lever, put it up or down, subtly during a song. And as I get more proficient, I'm going to do more. I'm really going to get that Prelude in C. I want the second half of Prelude in C, which has lots of lever changes because it's so beautiful. Bach, brilliant. The function of the pedals, so when they developed the double action pedal harp, they have 7 pedals. There are 7 tones in our scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the 8th is essentially back to 1, but the next octave. So each of the 7 pedals is assigned a tone. And then there are 3 positions on each of the 7 pedals. And I have not played the pedal harp myself. I get it, I understand it, but the pedal harpist, when they depress a pedal and change the position, they know by their feet. It's probably similar to an organist who learns to do this without looking. Lots of practice, you would do this. But what it's doing is these gears and the sets of levers up in the top of the harp that you don't see, if you got up close to it, you would see them all flip when you get closer to that. But they're changing the tuning just like that. And so it's where, rather than me, I just lifted all my levers, all the blues or all the reds or something else came up or went down. It's just more efficient and quick, happens more quickly. Thank you for asking. That's a really good technical question. Thank you. Any other questions for you? Well, thank you so much, Preston. I will share a beautiful song. Since I play the Celtic harp, I do play a lot of lovely Irish and Scottish and Welsh music. And I did not know, honestly, I didn't know much about the beautiful Celtic music before I came to this instrument. But when I did, it was like a part of me came home. And it's so beautiful. I don't only play that. I can play classical music. As you were arriving, I was trying to give you a little bit of a sense of different kinds of music, styles of music that I play, because it's not just one thing or another. It has lots of versatility, even the Celtic harp with its levers. But there's something about this beautiful Celtic music that to me is timeless. And it has this really eloquent beauty to it, some wonderful stories behind these songs. Eleanor Plunkett is a wonderful tune. About 1700 AD, it's considered an Irish slow air, which is a kind of Irish music. Eleanor came from County Meath in Ireland. She lived during the 1700s and was encountered by Mr. Turlough O'Carolan. Mr. Turlough O'Carolan is credited, although the harps were banned, he managed to keep himself out in the countryside and travel to homes. He was an Irish bard, and he made his living by playing the harp for people and writing songs, writing music, and he would exchange his harp music for room and board. Now that doesn't sound so unusual. That's not an unusual thing at all, except that there were only by the time he was doing this, there were only 10 of them in Ireland left because the harps had been banished. And harpers were, England created this vacancy of the harp and its harpers. But Mr. Turlough O'Carolan was blind. And I can't imagine playing this instrument without my sight. I really rely heavily on my sight. But he gave us over 200 beautiful Irish tunes, and he was known to create these tunes for people that he encountered along his travels. Miss Eleanor Plunkett, she was very distressed because she was the last person in her family line. And so Mr. O'Carolan wrote this beautiful tune, and I say, Eleanor Plunkett continues to live on in such a beautiful song. So she must have been pretty special because she got a great tune. So this is a little of Eleanor Plunkett. you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That is one of my favorites. Depends on what day you ask me. Well, thank you all so much. You've been so gracious to share your afternoon with me and to let me share some things with you that I found interesting. I hope it is of interest to you. And something that I will tell you, if you're interested in other programming like this, I'm hoping to be able to offer some other things that might be of interest to you. If you want to know a little bit more, I could have done a whole thing on Irish and Scottish music. It's a wonderful exploration, and some other interesting things about historical facts related to the music. But consider that, and if that's something of interest to you, let Denise know. And we'll see what we can do. But thank you, and I wish you a wonderful and peaceful day. My pleasure.